Good morning and welcome to the HR Talk Employment Equity webinar. My name is Nikki Hardwick and I am a consultant from HR Talk and I will be presenting the webinar this morning. As we go through the webinar this morning, what we will be talking about is various things relating to the Employment Equity Act, but also to try and understand as an organization what your requirements are, so what a designated employer is required to do, as well as what are the requirements of an Employment Equity Committee. If we have a look at the Employment Equity Act and in understanding what the requirements are, it is important that as the organization that you understand what the purpose is of the Employment Equity Act. Now, the Employment Equity Act was promulgated and put into place in South Africa in 1999. And the two main aspects of the Employment Equity Act are, one is to promote equal and fair opportunity in employment through the elimination of unfair discrimination. And then two is to implement affirmative action measures to redress the disadvantages in employment experienced by the designated groups. Now, when we look at those two aspects, very often they are misconstrued or put into place along with BE and other pieces of legislation. Now, this piece of legislation speaks into the employment of people and how you treat people, but more so than that is also implementing affirmative action measures. When we look at these two aspects, one of the main and cornerstones of the Employment Equity Act is the elimination of unfair discrimination. Now, when we look at unfair discrimination, there are 5 categories, which we'll go through now, in which unfair discrimination is defined. When we look at affirmative action measures, this is very often misconstrued or understood to be a particular group of people or one particular group of people, for example, African males or African females. But in actual fact, affirmative action measures are actually related to any designated group. Now, the designated groups that apply within employment equity are slightly different to those of BE, and they are different. So designated groups in terms of employment equity relates to African, Indian, colored, females of all races, as well as people with disabilities, all races and all genders. So when we look at the implementation of affirmative action measures, those are specific to those people in designated groups. It is not specific to African females, as an example, unless, of course, within your organization, you have an underrepresentation of African females. But as an example, an affirmative action measure within your workplace could be that you don't have people with disabilities within your workplace. And so you may need to, as an affirmative action measure, look at implementing different things within your workplace, like a wheelchair ramp or screens that allow people with visual impairments to come and work in your workplace. It could be a case of you have a workplace that doesn't have enough females, as an example. And one of those reasons is that you don't have female toilets, just as an example. Now, that could be an affirmative action measure that you put in place within your workplace. Often employment equity is done incorrectly because people's understanding of what affirmative action is defined by a particular group. So when we then have a look and we go through to the main and the cornerstone of employment equity, and the elimination of unfair discrimination is not unique, or is at least not designated only for designated employers. This applies to all employers in South Africa. So there are 5 elements of unfair discrimination. The main one relates to what is called Section 6.1 of the Act. Now, this relates to where it says that all employers may not unfairly discriminate against an employee. That includes anybody that is even coming to your workplace to make application for a job. So it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who's actually working for you. It can include those people that are there to apply for a position. So it really says that any employer may not unfairly discriminate, either directly or indirectly, in any employment policy or practice against any person on the basis of race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, family responsibility, and it includes other things like HIV status. It includes things like culture, language, birth, or on any other arbitrary ground. And what that really implies is that you, as an employer, cannot make a decision based solely on one of these things. So I'll give you some examples where these become key in South Africa. You may, within your organization, say, we don't employ women of childbearing age because it creates an impact to the business, and so we will only employ women after a certain age. Now, that in itself is unfair discrimination. You may decide that you don't employ pregnant people purely because that they're going to be off for a few months. Now, that on its own you cannot do because that is unfair discrimination. What the Act does say is that although there is unfair discrimination, you may also fairly discriminate. So when people look at discrimination, they almost negatively give a connotation to discrimination as that it is always negative. That is not necessarily the case. So you are allowed as an employer to fairly discriminate against someone. And there may be instances within race, gender, pregnancy, marital status, etc., in which fair discrimination is applicable and would be fair. So I will give you an example, is as a bus driver, if you cannot see, that would be fair discrimination because you need your eyes to be able to see. If you're doing a play, as an example, and you have a part that is specifically, for example, Othello, you may be specific and say, we will only employ an African male, as an example, and that could be deemed to be fair discrimination. So not all discrimination in the workplace is automatically unfair, but where you have a policy or a practice where it is an automatic, we don't employ Indian females, as an example, or in admin positions, we don't employ males because we have the assumption that males are not very good at admin. So in that situation, you wouldn't be able to automatically decide that that is fair discrimination. Another example where in society we just make assumptions based on gender or race is we'll decide that females cannot do jobs that are physical because they're obviously not as physical as men, they're not as strong, and so they wouldn't be able to work in those environments. And so in our job applications or when people are applying for positions, we will automatically, not through any specific policy, but just through practice, decide that a female cannot do that job. Now that on its own would be unfair discrimination. So when we look at discrimination and unfair discrimination, most of the other discriminations will feed back into that section within the Employment Equity Act. So that is the cornerstone of anything that we do within equity, as well as making sure that within the workplace we have policies and procedures that make sure that we have fair discrimination within the workplace. It is also quite important that as an employer, within your employment policies and practices, so when we come through to identifying barriers, is that you try and uncover things within your organization, not necessarily with a policy, but that has ingrained perceptions or beliefs that certain categories of people cannot do certain jobs. So as I mentioned before, some people will say, as an example, females can't do jobs in which they need to travel around the country because it's dangerous. That on its own is not necessarily fair because you've just made an assumption that they can't do that job. So in any employment policy or practice, you need to look at those and decide, is it something that is justified and is fair? And you would need to, if it was ever challenged, be able to justify and deem that to be fair if it was ever challenged from a CCMA perspective. They also added, so you'll see here on the first slide under number 1, they've also added in this particular section or on any other arbitrary ground. So what that implies is that a person, for example, could be coming to you to make application for a job. They may not get the job. They cannot decide, they cannot say that it was based on race, gender, sex, pregnancy, marital status, etc. But they may believe that there was an arbitrary ground, an unfair discrimination on an arbitrary ground that you decided they weren't going to get the position and or get the promotion. And that could pretty much be anything. Now, when we look at burden of proof, if somebody makes an allegation of unfair discrimination on one of those things that says race, gender, sex, pregnancy, etc., the burden of proof to prove that it was not unfair discrimination would lie with the employer. So the employer would have to justify that it wasn't discrimination, that the discrimination was fair, and that they were justified in the actions. If, however, a person makes a claim on any other arbitrary ground, so as an example, I come for a promotion, I don't get the promotion, and I believe it's because I drive a Tucson and you're a Toyota fan, and so you don't like people who drive Tucsons, as an example. That would be an arbitrary ground. You could also be that we used to be friends and now we're not friends because I did something wrong. That would be an arbitrary ground. In those situations, the burden of proof would lie with me as the person making the allegation to prove that the discrimination was not rational or fair, and that it was unfair discrimination. So that is the first element of unfair discrimination. And as I said before, is the cornerstone of the Employment Equity Act in deciding what is fair and unfair discrimination. Then we come to the second element, which also came in a few years ago, which was saying that a difference in terms and conditions of employment between employees of the same employer performing the same or substantially the same work must be paid at the same rate, or at least similar rates. Now, there's been a lot of confusion, or at least misinterpretation of this particular section. This does not relate to the wage gap in South Africa. So we're not talking in this section about what the person at the top versus the person at the bottom and trying to reduce that gap. This doesn't relate to this particular section. This specifically says that anybody, so people who are doing same or similar work or on the same level, who have the same accountability, responsibility, etc., must be earning the same or similar value or getting the same or similar benefits. And this specifically came into the Act because currently the wage differentials between men and women in South Africa is still too great. So as an employer, you need to be looking at your salaries and at your benefits and determining if you have people who are on the same or similar level, who are doing the same or similar jobs, and there is a difference in their terms and conditions and or in their salaries. If you have no justification, so you don't know why it is like that, then as an employer, you need to put in place things to try and rectify that, because that difference could be as a result of a historical practice where you decided that a female, I don't know, for example, earns less than a man, or you could decide a particular race group earns less than another race group, or it just could be that on that particular day, the person who was employing the person decided that that person was valued at more for no good reason other than what they decided on that day. So this does allow, and there is a code of good practice specifically relating to this, to justify reasons why people can have different terms and conditions and can have different salaries. And those include things like you're a better performer. It could be that you've been there for longer. So this doesn't say, and a lot of employees believe that because we have this element, everybody, regardless of service, regardless of performance, regardless of any of those things, any justifiable reason, we must all earn exactly the same if we're on the same level. That's not what this says. So this over here is specifically related to almost an undefined difference in terms and conditions, or an undefined difference in salary, where it could be related to something relating to section 6.1. So as an employer, you need to do that exercise to determine why there are differences. And if you cannot justify the differences, is to slowly rectify and make sure that people are starting to earn same or similar based on their years of experience, based on their skills and education, and based on all of those things that are in the code, to try and make sure that people are earning the same amount of money and or getting the same benefits. And just to be clear, you can have different levels in the organization where some people in a certain level may get different benefits to people within different levels. So as an example, people in senior management and top management may get a different benefit to those that are in semi-skilled. So we're not talking about different levels within the organization. We're talking about people within the same level. And this is also quite important when we look at the classification of positions. Very often when I go into an employer and we look at the classification of positions in terms of semi-skilled versus unskilled versus skilled technical, is often what people will do is they will allocate a person to a level based on that individual. Now, how this becomes a problem is you could, for example, have a receptionist that has a degree. Now, they will, for example, put that person in a professionally qualified. So they will allocate that person, although she's a receptionist, they will allocate her to professionally qualified. But the reception position will only, let's for argument's sake, say, be earning 5,000 Rand, whilst everybody else in that level is earning, 50,000 Rand. So when an audit is done by Department of Labour, they will look at that level and they will then say, why is this person, who's the receptionist, earning 5,000 Rand, whilst everybody else, what appears to be in the same level, is earning 50,000 Rand? And that will automatically look like there's a discrepancy in terms of this section. When you're defining positions, you need to ensure that you define the position and not necessarily what the person brings to the table. So if the position as a receptionist is that of semi-skilled, if the person has a degree, it doesn't really matter because that person is employed in a position of semi-skilled. And that's to ensure that you can adequately compare apples with apples within the same position. Then we move on to the third form of unfair discrimination, which is harassment of an employee is an automatically unfair discrimination and is prohibited. Now, this specifically refers to sexual harassment in the workplace. And when we look at harassment in the workplace, is as an employer, you have an obligation to ensure that you put adequate policies and practices in place to ensure that people, and this is not specific to females, is that people within your workplace are protected from sexual harassment. And secondly, is if they do make a claim of harassment or sexual harassment, that it is adequately dealt with. And this can also apply to if I, as an employee, go to your workplace and I'm sexually harassed at your workplace and you fail to adequately deal with it, I could have a claim against you. And I could have a claim against my employer if they fail to act correctly. That does not necessarily mean that the person who's being accused would necessarily lose their job because a proper investigation needs to happen. But if you don't do what you need to do and you don't follow the process correctly and are not protected, there is no limit at CCMA in terms of any compensation or award that could be made against an employer at this point in time. So it's very important that as an employer, that you have proper policy in place and that you ensure that this policy is implemented throughout your organization, predominantly to get rid of things like poor practice where people have, sexual jokes in the workplace and start to create a culture in which certain things are accepted, because it creates a difficulty for you as an employer to manage this correctly, and you could then be open to, a claim at CCMA if it isn't dealt with correctly. Then we get to the fourth element of unfair discrimination. Now, this refers to medical testing and has obviously come into the fore at the moment with, COVID and people having to be tested and employers insisting upon a result and that sort of thing. So it says here that you cannot do medical testing unless legislation permits or requires that testing, or it is justifiable in light of medical facts, employment conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So this is quite important, especially when you have a workplace where you've got a lot of workplaces where, you have a factory or you have something that you're required to do medical testing to ensure that how you come into the workplace is how you leave the workplace and that there isn't anything that the workplace has done to your detriment. But this can also be used where somebody is starting to abuse sick leave and you need to now see whether or not that person can continue to do the job, or you need to do things to accommodate them within the workplace. So you can do medical testing provided it meets these requirements. Then finally, the last form of unfair discrimination is psychometric testing, provided it hasn't met the requirements. Now, most psychometric tests within the world and South Africa, they have certain requirements. In other words, they need to be tested to be valid and reliable. They must be applied to the country that you're in. And there's certain things that they need to do before you can do psychometric testing. This is not really a big one that comes up often because most employers use psychometric testing that has been tested and it has been shown to be reliable and valid. But in any event, if you're going to use psychometric testing in any sort of promotions or recruitment, I would highly recommend that this is only used as one of the factors in making a decision and not the sole factor, as it could be challenged if it goes to CCMA. So these are the 5 elements of unfair discrimination. And this is where, when we're sitting from an employment equity perspective, and specifically in the employment equity meetings, that we would use this as a base on which we start to determine where there are barriers, do they relate to unfair discrimination? And we would use this as the cornerstone of everything that we do going forward. Okay. As I said before, it is not unfair discrimination to take affirmative action measures consistent with this Act, or to distinguish, exclude, or prefer any person on the basis of the inherent requirements of the job. So what this basically means is that as an employer, if you in your employment equity plan have specifically said that we need to, in a position, employ an African female, if you now get a whole lot of other candidates and you say, well, I'm not going to choose the African male, or I'm not going to choose the white female, and you only choose the African female because it is specific in your plan, that would not be unfair discrimination, even though Section 6.1 says that you cannot, just on the basis of race or gender, exclude someone. So if you want to do that, and if you have that ability within your plan, it is important that it is in your plan and you have specified it if you want to exclude people on the basis of race or gender. If it is not in your plan, you need to be very careful of just on the basis of race or gender to exclude someone if it hasn't been specified in your plan. Then secondly, and this is quite important, is that it is acceptable and it is not unfair to distinguish, exclude, or prefer any person on the basis of the inherent requirements of the job. Now, what has happened historically is that a lot of companies, what they would do is they would say, as an example, we need to employ African people. And so people would apply for the jobs. And so what they would do is the person wouldn't have the skills, wouldn't have the experience, and then they would employ them just on the basis of their race or their gender. It is important that even with equity, you need to make sure that you are selecting people based on their inherent requirements of the job and excluding people if they don't have those skills. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult within your workplace, obviously, to to continue working to have those people within your workplace. All right. As I said before, every employer must take steps to promote equal opportunity within the workplace by eliminating unfair discrimination. So whether you are designated or you are not designated, you still have an obligation to ensure that there isn't unfair discrimination within your workplace. And any employer can be liable for a claim of unfair discrimination in the workplace, regardless of how large or small they are. But even though everybody should do that, there are only designated employers that are required by law to submit to certain elements of the Employment Equity Act. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, is as a designated employer, and I'll talk about who are designated employers, and I'm also going to talk about what the possible changes are, which may make you not designated in the near future. So as a designated employer, these are any employers who employ 50 or more employees. They are designated employers. This includes people who are temporary employees. So anybody who has been employed to work in your workplace for less than 3 months, in terms of employment equity, is deemed to be a temporary employee. If you have someone who comes into your workplace and they are there to take over from someone who's gone on maternity leave and they are there for 4 months, from an employment equity reporting perspective, they would be deemed to be a permanent employee and they would need to be reflected in your employment equity report as a permanent employee. So when you're calculating the number of employees, and generally you would take it as at the end of your report, so the time that your report ends, or you would take it at your financial year end. So the number of people that are employed at that time would deem your 50 employees, and it must include both temporary as well as permanent employees. If you have less than 50 employees, but your turnover is more than the applicable turnover in terms of Schedule 4, if you need a copy of Schedule 4, if you're not clear, please let me know afterwards and I can send that to you. So if you have 3 employees, but your turnover in your particular industry is greater than the turnover specified by Department of Labour, you may still be designated or would then need to comply with the various sections of the Employment Equity Act. And then we obviously have other people which won't apply here, but as employers appointed by a collective agreement, municipalities, and most organs of state, except for the 3 that are listed there. I've actually included the annual turnover here. So these are the industrial sectors that they've specified. And in the new total annual turnover, if your turnover, as at your financial year end, exceeds that turnover, then you would be designated regardless of the number of employees that you would have. Sometimes, depending on your organization, it's a little difficult to slot yourself in here. There is no other definition other than what is given here, and you would need to slot yourself in there and decide what your turnover is, and then you would need to be designated and would need to comply. And that is complying with all aspects of the Act, not just submitting an employment equity report. If, however, and it is quite important, your turnover has gone less than this, so it doesn't reach these, and you are now no longer designated and you wish to deregister, the deadline for deregistration is the end of August. So if you do wish to deregister, please contact us so we can tell you what you need to do and we can assist you with that. Okay, so now we get into the requirements of a designated employer. It is quite important, and I'll go through the specific steps, and I'm going to go through the steps with you as if you have never done this before, but it's quite important that the order is followed and that things are done in a specific way, because if you haven't done certain things in a specific way, even if you have a plan in place, if you haven't done the analysis, then your plan is null and void. So it's important that you follow these steps, and then obviously if you're already an employer that is designated and you have been doing this, and you've got, for example, you've already assigned your senior manager, it's important that once we get to the analysis, you need to do a certain plan, that you have to follow those steps accordingly. So the first thing as a designated or a newly designated employer is you have to assign a senior manager or senior managers to be responsible for the implementation of employment equity within your business. This cannot just be a verbal assigning of that employer, or at least of that employee, is you need to put in writing what the employee is required to do or what the senior manager is required to do, and it has to be part of their job description. They are ultimately responsible for the implementation of the employment equity within your business. Unless you're a small business, it isn't recommended that both the CEO or the MD is both the senior manager and the CEO. If you can't help it though, well then it's your only option. But ideally, you need both the MD and then another senior manager. And depending on the size of your organization, you could have more than one senior manager. This needs to be put into the person's personnel file and then also kept within your employment equity file. Then the second requirement is to do communication, awareness, and training. So employees must be made aware of the Act, discrimination and diversity issues. This training, communication, and awareness isn't defined in the Act, so in terms of how often it needs to be done or the format in which it needs to take place. But it is important that as an employer, you tell people about these things. So this could be done via a newsletter. It could be done via posters. You could have sessions on an annual basis. So there's various things in which you can share information with employees to make them aware of what is going on here. We have had audits in the past with clients where inspectors have been quite specific about saying it must be done on an annual basis. However, it isn't in the Act that it has to be done on an annual basis, but it makes common sense to do that on an annual basis so that employees are constantly aware of what is going on with employment equity, what employment equity issues are, also what discrimination is, and then obviously diversity issues. Then as an employer, they must ask that every employee complete what is called an EEA-1. Now, this is an employee declaration, and where the employee is required to specify what nationality they are. So are they African, Indian, colored, or white? And just to make note that in terms of, there is another element, which is Chinese people. So there's South African Chinese people are included within the designated employees, and they actually fit within colored. They went to court and they made application to be included, and they are now included. So specifically South African Chinese, but they would fit underneath the colored element. So what the person would do is they would complete their form, specify African, Indian, colored, or white. They would say, are they male or female? And then they would obviously also specify whether or not they have a disability. Now, the disability is specifically specified, or at least the definition is specified on your EEA-1. It is not as well defined as if you were going to apply for a grant. So it basically says that it's an employee who has a short-term, not a short-term, a long-term or recurring mental or physical impairment that would substantially limit their entry into or advancement in employment. So that is the definition of disability within the workplace. And it can be quite broad because it could relate to depression, it could relate to high blood pressure. It's not necessarily just your physical impairments, which are sometimes very plain to see, but it could relate to a whole lot of mental impairments, or anything that relates to something where the employer would have to accommodate them within the workplace. Now, this EEA-1, as an employer, you have to request that employees complete this form. The purpose of this form is to ensure that the information that you're reporting to Department of Labor is accurate and correct. The employee can say no, and if they say no, then you must just use the information that you have at hand. The employee can also change the information on that form, so they have the right to go and look at the information. Obviously, changing things like your race would be, a little bit difficult, but a person could change from male to female. They could also change whether or not they had a disability. So they have the right to come back and ask to change that information. My recommendation is as part of your employment pack. So when you employ a person, you include this form as part of your take-home pack, and these forms must be kept within your employment equity file and not the employee file. Just remember that with POPI, this information is confidential, and so it cannot be readily available even to the Employment Equity Committee, but must be kept somewhere where it's confidential. But in an audit, you are able to give it to the Department of Labor to prove that you have done this. All right, moving on. Then we have to appoint an Employment Equity Committee. Now, the Employment Equity Committee must be representative of all stakeholders. So really what that means is that if in your workplace you have top management, senior management, and it goes down, you cannot have a committee that is solely made up of everybody in top management. You also cannot have a committee that is solely made up of, shop floor people. It has to be representative of everybody within your workplace. And normally what I would do is you almost do an analysis of your workplace to determine the majority of where people are lying. So if you have 80% female, then your workplace, at least your Employment Equity Committee, should be 80% female. If you have majority African, you have some colored, you need to look at your workplace to make sure that the people that are represented in the Employment Equity Committee are representative of what your workplace forum looks like. Not your workplace forum, at least what your workplace looks like. And then your committee, in terms of deciding how long they need to sit, that would be determined by the committee. And as your workplace changes and as you start to transform, so your committee will also transform. It is also important that you have everybody represented. And this is important because as an employer, when you're trying to determine barriers to employment equity, so why are you not getting people with a disability, for example? As an able-bodied person, you won't necessarily see things in a workplace that make it difficult for somebody with a disability to come work there. So that could be a barrier to employment equity that you're not seeing because you are able-bodied or you don't have a particular disability. As a female, I will see things from my perspective, which a male may not see. And so we go around and we see certain things. So certain groups of people and certain levels of the organization may have certain challenges that make it difficult for that group of people to come into your workplace or to continue working there. So the purpose of the committee is to try and give you as the employer an all-round view of the various challenges that you may be experiencing and to see what is actually happening, because you won't necessarily be able to see everything. Also with the committee is that ideally should be elected and not selected. So you as the employer shouldn't just select the people that you think will be great. This is sometimes challenging because sometimes you don't get anybody that is nominated and you don't get anybody that actually wants to be part of the committee. But ideally, if you've done the proper communication and awareness, people will understand what the committee is about and will hopefully want to be part of it. If you do have a challenge with that and people are not willing to be part of the committee, then you could approach people that do want to be part of the committee, obviously within the various stakeholders, approach them and then put out a memo to the staff to say, these are the people that have been selected. If you don't like it, or if you think you want someone else, please let us know. And by virtue of the fact that you've put it out there for everybody to give their approval, you've almost got, inverted commas, an elected committee. This committee must meet quarterly or monthly. You cannot meet less than that. And that is to line up with the monitoring and evaluating mechanisms, which we will talk about later. So part of the committee's role, which we'll go through just now, is also ensuring and assisting that the employer continually monitors and evaluates their employment equity plan and their progress towards achieving their goals. The equity committee, part of their key function is making sure that that happens. So at your equity committee meetings, you need to be making sure that part of that is looking at what has happened. I'm not going to go too much into that now. I'll talk about it just now. Now this is where a key aspect. So if you already have committees in place, you've already done all of those things. This is where people often, fall by the wayside and they don't do these steps. So they'll put a plan in place, but they won't have done the analysis. If an audit is done and you don't have a workplace analysis, then your employment equity plan is null and void. If you haven't conducted an analysis in conjunction with your committee, even if you have the analysis and you have the plan, none of that will matter. So what we then do is we've now appointed our committee, or we have a committee in place, and we now need to conduct a workplace analysis. And there's a specific document that is called the EEA 12, in which, as the committee, we need to have a look at our workplace, identify where we are falling short, and to start identifying barriers to employment equity. Often this is a very difficult one because people actually don't understand what is meant by that. And so as the HR manager or as the senior manager, we need to give information to the employees to say, we don't have enough females. Why don't we have enough females? Is it relating to recruitment practices? Is it relating to workplace accommodation? What is actually the reason why we're not getting females in here? And so we start to identify what those barriers could be. Now, the barriers are sometimes internal barriers, or they could be external barriers. So you could have a particular position or particular group of people within your organization that their skill is very specialized. And so the number of people that go into that particular field are very limited. And it could be a specific group of people. So, for example, Indian males that are attracted to that particular field. So as hard as you can try, you may not be able to get people within the other groups. So you have a barrier to employment equity of diversifying in that particular field. And you may not necessarily be able to put in place an affirmative action measure. So it's important that when we're looking at our analysis, we're looking at both external as well as internal barriers to employment equity to determine why our workplace looks like it does. So one of the key aspects here is looking at your workforce profile versus the demographics. And there are changes to legislation, which I'll talk about just now. But part of this is identifying your workplace, looking at what your internal statistics look like, and then looking at what the demographics look like from an external perspective, so that you can identify the underrepresentation of certain groups of people within certain levels, so that you can identify those employment barriers. It is quite important, and it's quite a good idea, is to do things like, so when you're trying to get employee input or input from the committee, is to do things like surveys. So it's to ask directed questions in which you can start to gather information, because as I say, a lot of committees, people don't know what to say. And so it is often very stilted, with the only person giving input is the HR manager or the HR department, because nobody knows what to say. So, trying to develop things that we have questionnaires and that kind of thing, which you can give to the committee, where they can answer very straightforward questions. And without knowing this, as we start to identify the barriers within the employment equity, that could be limiting the employment of people across certain groups. And this could be things relating to real life, for example, transport. It could be relating to challenges from a social perspective. So there's a number of things that could be impacting your ability to transform that you haven't even seen yet. Excuse me. So once we've now got our EEA 12, and we've put that all in place, and that will identify what our employment equity barriers are. Remembering you don't necessarily have to tick all of the things. Some of them you may not have a barrier in. So once we've identified our barrier, we put a proposed affirmative action measure in place, which comes from the committee, and we then say, what is our deadline? That then gets given to management to look at those proposed affirmative action measures, some of which will be accepted, some of which won't. So the Employment Equity Committee doesn't have the ability to make decisions and to implement things. They are completely an advisory committee, and they give their suggestions forward. Management decide on them, and then ultimately will say, yes, I agree, or no, I don't agree. So as an example, and I've had this before, we had an organization where young women weren't coming into the workplace because they were having babies. And the challenge is that they didn't earn enough money to send their children to a good daycare. And so they were leaving. And one of the suggestions from the committee was, let's start a daycare center. Now, that's a very good idea. But the problem is that if you're in the business of making computers, opening up your own daycare center is not your core function. So although the committee had decided that that was a great idea, management said, no, unfortunately, we're not going to do that. But how about we do this? And management put forward a different suggestion to put forward in the plan, and that was then ultimately accepted. So once we've accepted and management has agreed and the budget is put in place to say these are the things that we can do, the employment equity plan is then put in place. And your employment equity plan, so now you can see how the two fit together. And if you don't do your EEA 12, well, then your plan doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So now you have your EEA plan, which basically will take from your analysis all the things that you specified. So what the barriers are, where our challenges are, what are the agreed affirmative action measures that we're going to put in place, and when are they going to be put in place? So your equity plan is anywhere between 1 and 5 years long. That is legislated. It cannot be less than 1 year and it cannot be more than 5 years. That then gets put into place. You specify what is the time frame that you're going to achieve those. You put objectives in place as well. And you also designate a responsible person. Now, again, the responsible person cannot be the Employment Equity Committee, because you have people in that committee that don't have any powers of authority. So you cannot put someone in the Equity Committee who is now responsible for implementing a new recruitment procedure. You cannot put that person in there. So you may have a senior manager that is in there that is responsible for certain elements, but it would be that person's name. But the Equity Committee doesn't hold the accountability and responsibility for the implementation of the plan. So you now have your plan. That plan is ultimately goes back to the committee. The committee agree and they say, yes, we're happy with it. And that then goes back to the CEO who signs it off. And now that becomes our document to use as monitoring and evaluating over the 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever it may be. We put that in place. Part of the equity plan as well is putting in place targets to achieve your numerical goals. So we will say at the end of 5 years, we want to have X amount of African, colored, Indian, white. And we have then targets that say at the end of year 1, this is what we want to achieve, year 2, 3, 4, etc., so that we can monitor and evaluate how are we progressing. If there's a situation, and we'll get to, and that then gets put into your employment equity file. And it's quite important that before your plan comes to an end, and this is again where a lot of employers fall down, is your plan comes to an end and only then do you start developing your new plan. If you look at your EEA 13, it specifically says there that you as an employer should have your new plan in place at the expiry of your old plan at least 6 months before the expiry of your current plan. So there should never be a time where you don't have a current plan in place. So the minute the one ends, you should have a new plan in place. So your analysis needs to be done. So once your plan is coming to an end, you now need to redo your analysis and you need to do your plan again and put it in place so that when your current plan ends, you now have a new plan that is effective and has already been in place at least 6 months beforehand. Just to make note that in terms of the changes to legislation which came into 2019, the only time, most of the time if a Department of Labour come and do an audit, if you don't have the correct committee, if you haven't consulted correctly, what they will normally do is they will send you a compliance order, or they'll give you a time to basically make the reviews, and they will look at it and say, yes, I agree, no, I don't, change this, do this. They will normally do that. But if you don't have an employment equity plan in place, it is not signed by the CEO, or you don't have, or it is expired, so you've got one that is coming up and it isn't in place, they can request that you be referred directly to Department of Labour, or to Labour courts at least. So this is the one instance which they don't necessarily have to give you 60 days or 30 days to fix it. They can take you directly to Labour court. So this is a very important one that you need to make sure that you constantly have it in place, and then at least 6 months before you have your new plan in place. So looking at a 1-year plan, that can be quite onerous because you put your 1-year plan in place and you have to almost immediately start working on your new plan. So it's quite important to look at the duration of your plan, not having it too long, but also not necessarily having it too short. All right, then we move on to monitoring and evaluating mechanisms. So it's important that records are kept. It's important that you put in place monitoring and evaluating mechanisms within the workplace. So what does that look like? So at our quarterly meetings, what are we going to go through? What are the requirements? So who gives feedback to what? If there are things that are in there, how do we check that what needs to happen is happening? We also then need to evaluate the progress. It's structured in regular intervals, and that would almost mean maybe on an annual basis is to see how did we do? Are we still on track? We said we were going to have 100 employees at this point, but we now have 300. Do we keep our plan the same, or do we need to revise it with the committee and make a new plan and revise that plan to accommodate the changes in what has happened? And then, as it says here, is where progress is unsatisfactory, we need to emerge, or flaws emerge, we need to review and revise. So this is a constant thing that needs to happen. It's not something that happens once a year, just when you need to do your report. And then finally, we need to submit an annual progress report, which is submitting our EEA2 and EEA4 to the Department of Labour, which is the online system, or at least most people do that. It opens on the 15th of September and generally closes on the 15th of January, although the possible changes to legislation say that may be changing, although we don't know when. So those are the requirements of the designated employer. And like I've said, it's important that you go through those and that you follow the specific order quite carefully, and that you have the documentation so that if an audit is done, everything ties up. Okay, then just having a look really quickly in the changes in legislation. So as I said before, you have currently what is required is that an employer looks at their internal statistics, so their internal workplace, against the demographics. And I'll show you very briefly the demographics now. But you're supposed to look at the regional as well as national demographics, so the economically active population, which is shared by Department of Labour on an annual basis. You then determine, in terms of representation, how do you fare against those? The changes in legislation, or at least the Employment Equity Bill, which it hasn't been passed yet, is currently sitting with the Portfolio Committee, is now suggesting that they will give us sectoral targets. So that will probably be based on the industry sectors that we had before, that says that in agriculture, this is what we're requiring, and then they will give you a specific time frame within which to meet those. So we're not entirely sure how it's going to work and how it's going to play out, but this is what we're suspecting is going to be coming. We don't know when it's going to come. What they've also done is they're suggesting that they remove the turnover. So the only requirement will be you have to have more than 50 employees. So if you have less, regardless of turnover, you won't be designated and you can then deregister. You will have the ability to do voluntary submissions, but the requirements of voluntary submissions were not yet clear. So do you have to do everything, or can you do certain elements? If you don't do certain elements, can they give you can they not decide to give you a compliance certificate? We're not entirely sure how that is going to work. And then, as I said before, they're looking at the change in submission dates, which they're wanting to go back, it seems, to saying by 1st of October every year, whether you're online or you're doing manual submissions, everyone will need to submit. So we're hoping that that's not going to come into effect now, because that's going to push a lot of employers out, because a lot of employers are used to having from the 15th of September to the 15th of January. So we hope that if they do these changes, that it will only come into effect from next year. And then just in terms of, they do have now harassment and victimization codes of good practice, but these are still up for discussion. But these will determine how we deal with victimization and harassment in the workplace, but these are still up for discussion. I see we are on 10 to 10. So I want to go through very quickly with you just to explain some of the affirmative action measures. I think that I have gone through that, but this is just to really help you within your Employment Equity Committee, is helping people to identify what we mean by affirmative action. So as I said before, it is specifically for designated groups to ensure that people, that in terms of transformation, you are putting things in place, affirmative action measures, to try and assist and encourage people from the designated groups that are specific to your organization to be able to come into your workplace. Now, these can include appointing members from designated groups, increasing the pool of available candidates. Now, that could be doing things like creating internships, doing learnerships. There's a number of things that you can do in this space. Training and developing people from designated groups. And remembering, when we're saying designated groups, this is going to be specific to your organization. So if, when we look at the stats, you are 100% on target for African male, you wouldn't necessarily put affirmative action measures in place to encourage more African males to come into your workplace, because you're on a par there. If you are underrepresented from females, the affirmative action measures that you would put in place would be specific to those. So this is not an across the board thing, and every employer could be different depending on their circumstances. It could also relate to promoting people from designated groups. So that could be things like including succession planning, specific mentoring, coaching, guiding of identified people within your workplace, to get to a point where if positions come available, you now have trained candidates that you can now select from, which you wouldn't ordinarily have had before. It's also things like retaining people from designated groups. Now, one of the things when we looked at not section 6.1, but the unfair discrimination, one of the elements relating to equal pay for equal work is one of the fair discriminations is if you're trying to retain people from within designated groups, and as a result of retaining those people, you pay them a higher premium, that wouldn't be deemed to be unfair discrimination. So that is one of the things that you can use as well within trying to rectify the imbalances within your workplace. And then obviously we've got reasonable accommodation for people from the designated groups. Now, most of the time when we talk about reasonable accommodation is people will go straight to, you need to put a wheelchair ramp in. That doesn't necessarily mean that. So that could be doing things like, if you're trying to attract young females, it could be having policies in place that allow for, I don't know, more time off in case their child gets sick. It could be retention strategies. It could be making a bathroom for, somebody in a wheelchair. It could be, there's a number of different things depending on, it could be having a bus as an example for people who cannot get to your workplace because of transport costs. So there's a number of different things in terms of accommodation. It is not necessarily specific to people with disabilities. I see that there is a question, and I'll do the questions a little bit later. Then when we have a look, now, like I said before, this will change, or at least is supposed to change. This is an old one. It's from 2018. But when we're looking at our stats, what we need to do is to compare them to the stats that are given in terms of the economically active population. So this is the national EAP by population and gender group, given by Stats SA in 2018. Every year we're given new stats by Department of Labour, and we look at that, and obviously that will change because in terms of the economically active population is we're looking at people between the age of 15 and 64 who are willing and able to work. So we're not looking at moms that are stay-at-home moms. We're not looking at people who've retired at age 40 or people that don't want to work. This is people that are in the workplace, or at least in the market looking for a job. And this will obviously change because certain people will go out of the, in the following year will retire. People will get older than 64. People will come into the workplace. And this is basically what we're looking at to decide how do we fare in comparison to national statistics. As I said, they do ask you to do regional statistics as well. So these are the regional statistics. And if you have a look, you'll see here, as an example, in KZN, the African population sits at 86.3%, but if we go down to Western Cape, we've got 37.7%. So they ask you to look at both regional as well as national demographics to try and get a happy medium between the two. So depending on where you're situated within the country, your stats from a regional perspective will be different. So when we have a look at the kinds of things that you could be doing within your committee, is this would be a good example of trying to determine what do we look like and are we progressing? This is obviously just an example, but we would have here, so in 2015, we had 66.4% males versus 33.6%. Now we can't, because if you look at the stats here with males from 2015 to KZN and national, we're sitting with 66.4% versus the 47 and 49. Now, it would be an illegal labor practice to just now say, okay, well, now we have to get rid of all the men, so we fire them all so we can employ females. What we then do is we say, okay, we're underrepresented from a female perspective. And so what we want to do is our plan is going to be is that when people in certain positions, as an example, if a male leaves, we're going to try and employ a female in that position. And that's going to be part of our plan. So we have an IT technician, we're going to approach the varsity, and we're going to encourage females of whatever race or whatever gender, race, is we'll try and encourage those people, or we specifically want any female with a disability, and that is what we're going to put in our plan. And so every year we start to look at a particular point in time to see how are we progressing. So you'll see here, in 2015, we had 33.6, and as we move forward, we're now on 38.8%. So when Department of Labour come in and have a look, they'll look at this and go, are you progressing or are you transforming reasonably well? And so you go, we've got African, and they've gone from 65.6 to 70%. So we can see how we're moving from year to year to year to year. At this time, when we did this, there was another section which was other. I see that's now been taken out. But this is basically how you would look at your workplace to see if you're moving in the right direction. This I would recommend you do on an annual basis, and you can do interim stats sort of every 6 months to see how you are faring. If those stats are going, well, our plan was to go from 65 to 67, and all of a sudden you've gone down to 50%. The question is going to be why? What has happened that has caused your stats to go like that? Maybe the number of employees is actually, maybe you've retrenched. What has happened within your workplace to see, are we moving according to our targets, and are we moving according to demographics? And then you can obviously look at top 3 levels of management. Now, it's quite important to look at this as well, because if we look at the overall stats, you can see here African is sitting at 60, well, if we look at 2019, is 70%, which is not bad. But when we look at the top 3 levels, African is sitting at 45%, or initially started at 23%. So when we look at our overall stats, we go, oh, we're actually faring fairly well. But there is a push from Department of Labour to start saying we need to be transforming at the top 3 levels of management and seeing how we're going. If we're transforming everywhere else in the organization, but we still have no females, as an example, in the top 3 levels, well, we're not transforming. So what are we doing on an entire organization perspective versus what are we doing in top 3 levels? And so we go forward continually, and we keep these stats and we look at these to see if we are moving in the right direction. And then just very quickly, when we look at the committee, I've spoken about, okay, this is important as well, because often people don't understand what the committee is supposed to do and what they are versus what they're not. So as I've already said, they should be representative of all stakeholders, including the trade union. So if you have a trade union in your workplace, the shop steward should be on that committee. They can say no, but then you just put in writing and you approach the trade union and you ask them why, but they can decide they don't want to be there, but they should be, by virtue of the fact that they're there, invited to be on that committee. So the aims and objectives of the committee is to assist and guide management to achieve the objectives. So this is quite key when we look at the responsibilities. So what the committee is responsible for is helping you as the employer to identify employment barriers. So they look at it from their perspective. We look at the demographics and we start to unpack based on that EA 12. Why are we not transforming? Why can we not get a certain group of people? They can then assist in recommending steps to eliminate those employment barriers, help to determine the degree of underrepresentation in certain designated groups at various levels, recommend steps to address those specific underrepresentations. They will consult on the preparation of the plan, provide input into the annual reports, and help you to monitor progress towards the implementation of the plan. The committee is not a bargaining forum. Okay, it is not a replacement for a workplace forum or replacement for shop stewards and trade unions. Very often within an employment equity forum, it gets completely sidetracked because we now want to start talking about operational issues, the fact that this manager has done something to that employee. We start talking about the fact that people are not happy with their increases. Employment equity is not about operational issues. It's about the larger picture of implementing and transforming within your workplace from an employment equity perspective. Another key thing is, as I said before, is the Employment Equity Forum is an advisory forum. They can give input into the plan, but they have no accountability or responsibility for ensuring that it happens. And the reason for that is when we have a look at the fines that are implemented, and a lot of employers will know that is if you don't comply, depending on what you haven't complied on, is there's a fine of up to 1.5 million. Now, if the committee has the responsibility and accountability to implement this and ensure that it happens, then they are also liable for that fine. So it's quite important as an employer is that you explain to the committee what their role is and what they can and cannot force an employer to do. So they cannot force an employer to select certain people. There are ways in which, if they're unhappy with what the employer has done and decisions and the fact that they're not taking into account the committee, you can lodge grievances and you can do all of those sorts of things. But the very nature of the committee is to be an advisory committee. They are not another workplace forum. They cannot demand things. They cannot insist upon things. They cannot negotiate on different terms and conditions. That is not their role. So that is basically with regards to the committee, with regards to employment equity, the various elements that as an employer you need to sort of unpack and understand when implementing employment equity within your workplace. So we do have, if anybody is interested, we do have an ability, so we have an online form that if you're wanting to check, very basically, it's not a Department of Labour audit, but very quickly is to check your compliance You go in, it takes about 5 minutes, and we will send you a report which basically identifies the areas of risk that you may be facing. And if you want to do that, you can send an email to us afterwards, and I will send you the link, and then I will send you the report. There is no cost to it, so you can use it, you can share it. There's no problem with that, and we will send you that report afterwards. If you want a copy of the presentation, I'm happy to send it to you. Alternatively, it will be made available on our YouTube link on obviously YouTube, or you can email us and we will send you a link as soon as we've uploaded it. If you do have any questions or you need some advice, please feel free to contact me. You can email me directly on Nikki, N-I-C-K-Y, @hrtalk.co.za, or you can call me on 083 788 6999. I hope you've all enjoyed today. I hope it was informative, and we will see you soon. Thank you. Bye.